Hello, my name is Donna Kane, and I'm the organizer of Wild Words North on behalf of the Peace Liard Regional Arts Council. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the Regional Arts Council lives and works on Treaty 8 territory. Today, I have the great pleasure to introduce the session Puzzles, Prisms, Tributaries, Tapestries, Unconventional Story Shapes, and What They Offer. And the two authors today who will be talking about this subject are Leona Theis, the author of If Sylvie Had 9 Lives. And Leona, do you want to hold it up? Yeah. I have a copy. It's an amazing book, but it's in Halifax, not here in the office I'm in today. And the other author is Susan Olding, and she has a new book of essays out called Big Reader, and it's an amazing book as well. So what I'm going to do is hand it over to Leona and Susan, and welcome today. And I'll be in the background, hopefully assisting with slideshows and whatnot. So anyway, okay, take it away.
Okay.
Thanks, Susan.
Yeah, thanks,
you.
Donna. Thank you, Donna. Yes, I want to acknowledge that I am coming to you from Victoria, the traditional territories of the Kwanghan people. So I'm grateful to be living and working on these lands. I'm going to start by chatting. It's such a pleasure to talk to Leona in this way. I think we've only met once in person at a creative nonfiction collective conference, very briefly, and didn't even have time for an in-depth discussion. But I first encountered her writing in a piece of nonfiction, her CBC award-winning essay, The Occupations of Muriel Thompson. I just love that essay for its inventive structure and use of point of view. Okay. And it intrigued me immediately. It had all the qualities of the greatest fiction, the detail, the characterization, the, emotional quality. But it was such an interesting way to approach the subject, because it was a piece of nonfiction, a memoir about a family member, but told in the third person. So it required some research, some memory, and quite a bit of imagination, I think, to get inside the mind of this character. So I've often used that piece in my teaching to try and encourage students to take more risks in their creative nonfiction and to experiment a little and play and have fun, because I think it really offers those possibilities. But Leona, you've been writing fiction for longer, I think, than you've been writing nonfiction. Yeah. And now you have a wonderful novel, If Sylvie Had 9 Lives, which displays all the strengths of that piece of the first piece of nonfiction of yours that I read, and then some. I enjoyed this book so much. It really gave me a lot of pleasure and a lot of it. It's just so playful and fun and sexy and funny. And Sylvie's such an interesting character. And, I could talk about it in so many different ways, but we're here today, especially to talk about structure. And, most novels follow a character characters through one life path or a portion of a life path. And we know, this is the situation that the character is facing, and this is what's going to happen, what's going to happen given that this character is in this situation. But If Sylvie Had 9 Lives is constructed in a very different way. It is a novel told in stories, but it's also a kind of grown-up choose your own adventure. Because instead of following Sylvie through one circumstance and life path, we follow her through a number of potential life paths. We meet her at a moment of, at a crucial moment when she has to make a very difficult choice. And then we get to know her in different ways, assuming that she's made different choices. So we follow her through these different paths. So I'm really curious about what got you thinking about how, what gave you the idea to try to write a novel with this structure and in this form?
Well, thanks for that question. Yeah, it's kind of a roundabout book, and I came upon that idea in a roundabout way. And so I'm happy to take a stab at that question. Just before I do that, I want to locate myself here. I'm coming to you from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is in Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, the Dene, Saulteaux, Dakota, and it's also the traditional homeland of the Métis. And as ever, I am grateful to be able to live and work and share here. I'm also grateful to be part of Wild Words North, which is a festival I've followed for a while, and it benefits from the energy and skill and leadership of Donna Kane. So thank you, Donna. And so to the question about structure and shape and how I got there. One of my favorite parts of the writing process is when I begin to understand the shape of the project that I'm working on. It gives the project more momentum. It makes the writing easier. It may be that way for you, Susan, I'm not sure, but it helps me find a way forward. Unfortunately for me, the understanding of shape often comes quite late in the process. So I envy readers and I think, or writers, and I think you're one of them, Susan, who find that shape earlier. For me, it's quite a struggle to see a shape. But once I do, it's lights coming on. And in the case of Sylvie, If Sylvie Had 9 Lives, it was, as usual, a process that combined inspiration and experimentation and what I think of as just wrestling. In the beginning, I had a scatter of short stories and I had written them independently about different characters, never with the idea that they would be part of the same project. And I was writing them sort of as diversions from working on the novel I was working on at the time. It's a novel that I was stumped on, and I set it aside in order to give it a rest. It's still resting, by the way. So I decided to give it a rest, and I pulled out these stories to have a look at them. And the more I looked through them, I could see that these different stories, from the point of view of different characters, could almost be about the same woman, almost but not quite. The different characters shared some sensibilities, some fears, and some desires, but their circumstances varied so widely that they didn't hang together as a group. So I didn't feel like I could use them that way. So I did what I often do when I have a writing problem that won't budge, and that is I stopped thinking about it so hard. And I got away from the page and the screen for a while. And I know enough about my process by now to know that some of my toughest writing problems have been solved when I haven't been staring at them so hard. So either I go somewhere or I put my body in motion or I work on a different project. And I think of it as letting my brain take a holiday in a place where the windows are wide open and anything can blow in and blow out. And so I did that. I gave myself that kind of break in different spaces. And things did indeed blow in, and some of them blew out quite quickly as well. And that's probably a good thing. But in this case, one thing did blow in and settle, one idea. And I have a slide that shows the eventual form that this idea took once it had been refined. So, Donna, do you have that slide of the map?
Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is a visual representation of that idea that blew in and settled down, but it didn't appear like this right away. This is what it looked like after I had done some experimenting and sketching, and then a wonderful designer named Natalie Olson took her turn at finalizing the picture. And I'll explain how that picture came to be. what happened when I was sort of not thinking about the problem and settled on this new idea was that I realized that those different stories about different characters, that scatter of 4 or 5 drafted or half drafted stories that I had, actually could be about the same woman if at crucial moments in her life she had made different decisions that made her circumstances change. So if she had decided whether to go to school or take a job or be with one partner, or have a baby or terminate a pregnancy or save a life, or in fact, maybe not. In a typical plot structure, once a character takes any one of those actions, a whole set of plot lines and possibilities just disappear, poof. And so they trail out behind like ghosts that never play out. And so what I decided was that, in fact, I could write a book where I gave my character the chance to make one decision, but then also make the opposite decision and see how those both played out. And I let her do that over and over 9 times. And so having decided on such a structure, it made for a complicated book. And I needed ways to help readers find their way through it. So what you see in the image is one of the maps that's interleaved between the different sections of the book. The different sections take place 5 years apart. So beginning in 1974 with a single situation, branching off from there according to 3 different decisions Sylvie makes. And then each of those branches off another 3 times. So I came upon this structure of a delta, which the designer helped me create on the page. But it didn't start out as a delta. I did a lot of sketching of different ideas. I had a spider web, I had a tree branching, I had a fox and geese game with spokes of a wheel tramped out in the snow. But I finally chose the idea of a delta because I liked its openness and its flow. Mm-hmm. You can see also in the image, there are 9 lines that appear darker. And then there are also some ghost lines. And what those represent are the other alternate lives of Sylvie. I imagine her having a myriad of alternate lives. And I could only really manageably lasso 9 of those and get them onto the page. So those pale, faint lines are imaginary lives that I couldn't get onto the page. What else to say about that?
Well, we follow the character for 40 years. I think that's significant, and through different potential paths. And I think you were going to read from a section, were you not?
Yes, I do have just a few sentences to read, because in addition to having a visual image to help readers through, I wanted a way for readers to imagine this idea of 9 lives. And in fact, I wanted my character to imagine it too. So I'll read something very short, just from the very beginning of the book, to help, where Sylvie herself is imagining and in fact longing for those alternate possibilities in a life. So this is in the year 1974, where Sylvie is 19 years old. So it's the beginning of it all. And she's dancing at a downtown club. And the song she's dancing to is called Proud Mary, which refers to a riverboat. So Sylvie is thinking about a river branching into multiples of itself, no longer a single stream, but a delta. And if her life were such a delta, she might let the flow take her in a direction far from the current she was in now. If only there were more Sylvies to ride the separate streams. The further she went, the further she'd be from herself. she could end up way down the shore, so far from this Sylvie, the Jack marrying version, that all she could do would be to wave and hope to be seen. So from that first chapter, then her life does move off in all directions.
In so many directions. That's right. And it's such a beautiful, I mean, that again, structurally, this is so interesting what you've done, because you've allowed Sylvie to imagine into the future at the very beginning of the book. So you cue the reader that, oh, there's something maybe coming up here that's a little bit different. But this play of time is also it feels very riverine to me in itself. And I just want to show the two covers beside one another, because we share a wonderful designer, so that accounts for some of the similarities between them. But this image of a river is also one that appears in my book and is a theme running through both books, I think. So yeah. Anyway, but I wanted to ask you, Leona, with a structure as complex as this one, what did you when you're dealing with multiple trajectories of stories, you have to bring the whole thing somehow to a satisfying close. Each story is very much itself and has, in fact, a narrative arc. And I do want readers to, know that actually you can read this book as a book of short stories and enjoy it very much that way. You could start it any old place and read that story and enjoy it as a story if you wanted to. I think it's much more satisfying. Yeah, no, I absolutely. You could. What's that Alice Munro says? It's it's like a house of many rooms, and you can approach it whichever way you like. But it's all it is, as a novel, you want to bring it to a complete really satisfying close. So how did you manage to do that?
Yeah. Well, it was a big job toward the end. And it's true that on the way through doing all the editing, my editor and I, Debbie Willis, talked at different points about, in a novel in stories, how it's so important that each story on its own feel complete and undeniable. So that was a big part of the crafting and the editing. But at the same time, there has to be reasons to call it a novel and have it flow through from beginning to end and come to a satisfying end. And it's true that when you have that many plot lines going off in different directions, you can't really conclude any one of those, but you do have to bring the final story as well as the book at the same time to some satisfying feeling of an ending for readers. So I did this partly by, in the final story, picking up some threads from earlier in the book and just giving a tug on those threads, bringing forward some repeated images, some recurring patterns in Sylvie's lives, and bringing those threads together and bringing them forward into the final story, and also some developments that play out across the span of the book. For instance, there is a storyline about Sylvie's mother that leaves a question unanswered, and there are different reveals in different chapters about that storyline. And in the final story, I didn't want to actually answer that question, but I wanted to resolve it in some way by showing how Sylvie, by the time she's 59 at the end of the book, is dealing with that unsolved mystery. Mm. So in addition to doing all those things to provide some continuity, the final story had to tell a good story with a good ending of its own. So it had a very big job. And by the end of the book, Sylvie is 59, and I'm hoping that by then, in 2014, at the age of 59, she has actually matured enough, because she's a flawed character, and she's selfish and impulsive, and she's completely insatiable. Even with 9 lives, she wants more of everything all the time. I was hoping by the time she's 59 in 2014, she can at least come face to face with some of those patterns and not necessarily solve them or resolve them, but deal with them, recognize them. So I wanted her to recognize or come face to face with a few things in the final story. One, her fear of falling, which had been a lifelong thing, her difficulties with close relationships, and her insatiability, the way she wants more of everything, even and including love. And finally, since it's by now 2014 and we have a climate crisis, I wanted to relate that in a wider sense to the idea of insatiability of human beings in general. So I'll read just the setup of that final story, just the first couple of pages. This is called Blueberry Hill. Speeding down the wickedest stretch of Blueberry Hill, their skis scrape through yesterday's 2 fresh centimeters of snow to a layer of week-old ice. Stay loose, Sil shouts ahead. Stay low. Use your edges. It's all she can do to keep from falling, and she's no novice on cross-country skis. Lolly? Well, she's just audacious. Sil's lost sight of the girl in her bright yellow jacket. There's a final long turn to negotiate before the grade will level out. Rain should not fall at this altitude in the Rockies at this time of year, or not in the amount it fell last week. A rain on snow event is the term she and the others on the research crew use. The new normal, Brian is fond of saying, is that when it comes to weather, there's no such thing as normal. He's the expert, the lead scientist. Sil manages the treacherous turn, and there's Lolly, stepped to one side of the track and waiting. Relax, Granny, yes. The other 2 grandmas, Lolly's grandmothers by blood, are Gran and Nan. Sil would have preferred her plain first name, but never mind. Just don't break some part of yourself on this hill, precious girl. To calm her jittery knees, she snaps out of her bindings, stretches one leg and then the other, knocks the snow off her boots, and snaps back in. She could wallop her fellow grad student, Kirby, who said, "Take her up Blueberry, she'll love it. Stop somewhere on the way down, listen to the birds." What sort of birds? Dunno, the sort that sing. Sil doesn't hear bird song as well as she used to. Lolly, do you hear birds? Yeah, I guess. What sort? Dunno. The sort that sing? Early morning, and it's time to get out there. Don't keep the reporter waiting in the cold. Sil dresses in the dark so as not to wake Lolly. She hopes this guy won't be a nuisance. None of them make the climb to the Patrina Ridge sites alone. They buddy up. But yesterday, Brian asked if she'd be all right with a different sort of buddy. Could she take this person from the newspaper along? It'll be good for the project, he said. Probably some cub making his newsman's bones at the local weekly. Well, he'd better be fit. These mountains will lob something new at you on any given day. Up on the slopes, you're only as strong as your weakest link. Your leakest wink, her first husband used to say, with a wink. Last year's floods were catastrophic, and now the TV and the papers and the news blogs want to know what Sil and the others on Brian's team hope to accomplish with their high-altitude weather stations, their wind speeds, their sounding of snow. Groping through a drawer in the dark to find her socks, Sil stubs her toe on the dresser. Shit. Lolly stirs. Sorry, a whisper. The young, so vulnerable with their defenses given over to sleep. She eases the bedroom door shut, flicks on the light in the larger room, hears the first hollow sputter of the coffee pot, and catches the wake-up smell of it. She eats porridge, toast, and egg. A person needs a strong start for such a day. Into her backpack, she stows a thermos of hot broth, 2 peanut butter sandwiches, granola bars, toolkit, and a down jacket stuffed into a compression sack. laptop at the back. First aid kit, check. She straps her snowshoes to either side of the pack. Her black toque isn't on the hook, so she borrows one of Lolly's, pale blue with a dance of yellow snowflakes around the band, and snugs it over her short hair. Funny how wearing a young girl's hat can make a person feel she's shed 10 years. One last pee and out the door, poles in hand. The reporter's there ahead of her, waiting at the trailhead. It isn't yet light, but she can see that the hair that curls out from under his toque is gray. He must be as old as she is, older even. Trim enough, though. I'm Syl, she shakes his hand. I'm Robin, hi. Does your editor often send you on day-long backcountry treks? Just this once so far. His teeth are white in the dimness, a confident smile. It's no walk in the park, this. She settles her headlamp over her hat and clicks it on. I expect not, he said. So I'll stop there and let you trust that I've brought her face to face with some of those things I've been talking about. And I'd like to set Sylvie aside there and let her rest for a while, because I'd like to shift over, Susan, to talking about form as well in nonfiction and all its possibilities. It's a pleasure to be talking about this book and all the beautiful and complicated forms you've achieved in the various essays throughout the book, but also the delightful choices you've made with form that give the book a pattern as a whole. Mm. So I want to ask you some questions about how you achieved those various things. But briefly, before I get to my first question, I just want to introduce the book, which is a collection of essays about the printed word and more. It's about reading not only the printed word, but it broadens the idea of reading in some cases to take in the ideas about reading place and reading works of art, and also about, and I think you maybe use this term specifically, reading the book of our own lives. So that broadens the idea of reading. But in terms of the printed word, you have essays about reading such books and rereading such books as Anna Karenina and The Golden Notebook and Oliver Twist. And you have some braided essays that combine talking about that experience of reading and rereading those books. That's one strand of the braid, but you also bring in a strand that tells stories and episodes and narratives from your own personal experience. And those sections are both moving and thought-provoking. And in many cases, they had me thinking about decisions in my own life that sent me, like Sylvie, this way or that way. So they resonated for me that way. So there are braided essays. So that's one form you use. You also have an essay that's shaped like a triptych with 3 loosely related narratives. And I'll ask you about that later. You have an essay that follows the watercourses of Toronto. You have one essay that's kind of a play of puns, where the puns bounce back and forth between wordplay and visual art. And what's wonderful about all these different forms of essay writing is they allow the different parts of the essay to talk to each other and strike against each other and sometimes argue with each other. And they also give, when you take a jump from one strand of a braid to another, or one section of a triptych to another, they give the readers some room to work as well. And I love writing that gives the reader room to make her own comparisons and find her own similarities and let the resonances with her own experience happen. So that's one of the beauties of all the various forms.
Well, thank you so much for that. That's really, I mean, wow, that's exactly what I had hoped would strike a reader. So you've really, that means a lot. Thank you.
Oh, that's good. Well, they really do work that way. But beyond the form in all the separate essays, you've done some delightful things with the shape of the book as a whole. For instance, you have an early section of a number of essays that you called the verso, which when you're looking at an open book, that would be the left-hand page, right? Mm-hmm. And another section of essays that you call the recto, which would be the right-hand page. So it's an homage to a physical book. Mm-hmm. In between those two, you have an essay that you call the hinge. And I'm quite taken with all those things. My first question, though, is about something else about the overall form of the collection, and that is the prose poems that you have interspersed between the essays. Mm-hmm. They are written in the second person. It's it's an invitational pronoun, I find, that brought me in quite close to the reading. And so while I knew it wasn't me who'd had those experiences, I felt like I could imagine it being me. So I love that use of the second person. I think of them as prose poems because of their compression and their attention to double meanings of words, their attention to sound and syllable and images. And as I say, you've interspersed them between the essays in the book. They're quite short. They're set in italics. And I wonder, did you write them all at once, or did you write them separately? And how did you come on the idea to do this interspersing? I guess I'm asking three questions at once. And you probably, because they kind of overlap, what do you want those shorter prose poems to do, each on their own and together?
Oh, thank you. It's a great question. Yeah. I feel like I'm going to echo something that you said in your answer to my first question. The structure actually did not come early at all. Oh. Certainly the structure of the overall book did not come early. So, I mean, I began this book much as you did. I wrote an essay and I had this essay, and then I wrote another one, and then I wrote another one, and I realized, oh, actually, these are all sort of loosely related to reading. Maybe something is developing there. And from that point on, I sort of started more consciously trying to asking myself questions about my life as a reader and what might I have to write about and so on. So I, over the years, I started collecting more of these essays, and some of which seemed to fit and some didn't. And of course, some didn't make it into the book at all and others did. But I very much wanted it to be, while I love collections of essays at all times, I also wanted it to be a book, a unified thing somehow, maybe especially because it was about books. It had to feel like a comprehensive whole. And I was really unsure how to make that happen when I had, all these, even though the essays are personal essays and they have to do with my life, some of the themes other than reading that run through them are quite disparate. So I wasn't sure what I was going to do about that. And I really knocked it around a lot, and I left it alone a lot, and I went for walks a lot, and I did all the things that you did, and nothing really came to me. But finally, actually, when I sent the book out, it actually had a completely different title. It was named after an essay that no longer appears in the book, and it was accepted for publication that way, but I wasn't satisfied with it. So I continued to work on it after acceptance, and really just I think I just mulled on it, and I asked myself eventually, there are so many books about reading and the neurobiology of reading and the positive effects on our, emotions and intelligence and et cetera of reading. And there are also books about rereading out there already. And I thought, what do I want to do that's different to my mind from what all these other books have done? And why did I approach this subject in the first place? What was I really writing about? And I realized that, these essays were written mostly in a period of grief, a decade during which I lost both my parents, had a number of very difficult family issues apart from that to deal with, and some professional setbacks as well. And so I was quite often in a state of sadness and a feeling. I was dealing with a lot of loss. And one of the losses was reading. I felt like I was losing myself as a reader. And part of that had to do with the encroachment of the internet and the way that changes our reading experience. And part of it had to do with time. I just didn't have time because I was in that period of midlife when women, most of us, are trying to do too much. So I was heartbroken about this loss, but I wasn't really acknowledging it to myself. But that's why I was writing about reading. And I realized that. So I thought, what I want for this book to do is give the reader some intimate sense of what it is to be a reader, to approach the reader intimately. And that is how I hit on, okay, I'm going to have sections where I speak in the second person, just precisely because I think it does achieve a level of intimacy that is sometimes, not possible with other voices. Bring the reader in, get close to the reader, give the reader that intimate feel for sections of the book. And I decided to thread them through, intersperse these kind of shorter prose poem pieces with the others. And I didn't write them all at once. I had a couple I think I had written before, and I came across them in my files, and I looked at them and I thought, oh, that's interesting. And eventually then I wrote the rest of them. So I was going to read one of them now, if that's okay, a short one. And it's not the first one, but it's the second one in the book. And it's called Chorus. You love the library smell, sweet like vanilla, bitter like chocolate, fresh like cut spruce, dry like toast. There are 2 rooms, one for grown-ups like your mother, one for kids like you. Weekday afternoons, the children's room is quiet. Everybody's at school. Today, you're recovering from chickenpox. So instead of sitting cross-legged in Mrs. Clarkson's kindergarten, you're here, all by yourself. Dust motes, slippery floors, shelf after shelf of higgledy-piggledy spines. Reach for a book. Its clear plastic cover catches the light. Feel it crinkle under the flat of your palm. Bring it close. Breathe deep. Then blow. It fogs like a window pane. Open. Greens, oranges, yellows, reds, an explosion of color. Pictures of familiar vegetables crowd each page. Juicy pigments, so rich, so bright, your pupils shrink at the sight. Tomato, beans, potato, cabbage, corn, big, much bigger than life size, big enough that you feel small, feel embowered, feel embraced, as if you stepped through a portal into a different magical place. Simple kitchen garden crops, like the ones in your granny's garden, somehow made beautiful, made powerful with paint. You could look at them all day. But something else arrests your eye. Under each picture, a string of letters. The pictures tell the story. But how does this happen? The images retreat. They seem to fade. 1 minute, they are figure. The next, they are ground. The letters leap forward. They vibrate. They sing. Not in solo, the way you've learned to identify them, not as A, B, C, but for the first time ever, together. They are little choirs. You feel your lips forming shapes. The pictures are beautiful, yes, but you don't need the pictures. You are making pictures of your own, inside your head. You are reading the words.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you.
It does really read well as a piece of poetry. And each of those short sections does. What I found, I read them as they came along, as I was reading through the collection the first time. And then after I'd finished, I put those pieces together and just read them sequentially as a complete essay. Do you think of them as a complete essay in and of themselves?
Well, I didn't until after the book came out. It was so strange. And I did. As soon as I saw the book in its shape, I realized what I had done. And I really didn't intend to do it, but I think it happened that way. Yeah. No.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Because early on, I felt that by the time I got to about the third one, I was starting to put them together in my mind, and I knew I would go back and read them as a complete essay. And that very young reader that you were just reading to us about progresses, and in fact, the essay makes a kind of a one reader's beginning whole, and it spirals around and revisits things from later on in the essay, what I think of as the complete essay. Mm-hmm. And they also unify the book. So speaking as a librarian, a former librarian, one of my tasks used to be sometimes to mend physical books with binding tape or chipping in stray pages. And I think of those prose poems altogether as a kind of bookbinding.
Oh, wow. What a lovely image. Thank you.
But they really did work that way to hold things together in an almost physical way. There are other things about the book that recall my days as a former librarian. And one of them is the very cover with a picture of a catalog card typewritten, the same type of catalog card that I used to sit and type up at a manual typewriter.
Yeah.
And also the things I referred to before, the section that's the verso and the recto and the hinge. I want to ask you about the hinge in particular. In the middle of the book, there's an essay called Light Reading, and you refer to it as the hinge. And my question is about two things, both the essay itself, this triptych called Light Reading, and its function as a hinge to the book as a whole. So briefly, before I ask you to answer, I'll say the triptych called Light Reading presents three different loosely related ideas. And the title of it, Light Reading, has at least three meanings in this case, which is just one example of where your love of language shines through, as it does line by line throughout all the essays in the book.
Thank you. Well, I could say the same about you.
Well, thank you. I know that we both love language and love places where it puns and where it has multiple meanings.
Yes.
And so it has at least three meanings in this case to do with the three sections of the book, your mother's failing sight, or the three sections, of the essay, your mother's failing sight, your own creeping disengagement with a certain type of reading that you had mentioned, and then the photography of André Cortège. Is that
Yep.
And so I'd like you to talk about what how you came upon that form of the triptych. Did you know those pieces went together when you were writing them? And then it's a tough question. Another one of those wrestling things.
Yes, exactly.
And then I'd like to also know what makes that essay, the triptych, suited to be the hinge of this book that is your book.
Well, again, a good question and a tough question. This essay was one that I struggled with. It was actually, I think I was working on this essay for years, to be honest, and wasn't satisfied with it. And originally it was 2 essays. The Cortez section was its own piece, and it was actually much longer. I had more parts to it. And then as the part about my mother was more or less as it is. And then the part about, different aspects of reading and the science of reading and what we know about how reading affects the brain, and my sort of creeping disengagement with reading or sense of loss about reading. Those were together, but they weren't really sitting well together to me. Okay. I think I really honestly don't know what made me throw those 3 together and see how they would sit side by side. I think it happened very close to the end in the editorial process with Naomi. I think I said to her, I had not been satisfied with it, and as it was, and she thought it was working, and we kind of went back and forth on it. And then I think I finally said, okay, what if I do this and put them in this order and call it a triptych? And she said, yes, actually, yes. So we went with that. What makes it the hinge for me, I think, is something that I alluded to earlier. I think it's really, in a sense, the heart, the problem that the essay confronts was the problem at the heart of my reason for writing. So it was very much at the middle, the core of what I was doing. And I think that is the point at which I'm sort of reckoning with that problem more honestly with myself and with the reader as well. I think up until that point, it's not to say that issue doesn't come up in some of the earlier essays in one way or another, but I think I wanted to have a place where the reader would sort of pause and recognize, okay, what is really going on here? And then be able to, you talked about breathing spaces earlier. I think it's one of those spaces where the reader can is sort of invited to ask some questions about what is this all really about, and then to move forward into the rest of the book. So I don't know if that's an answer, but it's probably as good an answer as I can give.
Well, I think of it as, again, one of those places where the 3 portions of it give the reader room to draw on her own experience and bring her own meaning to it as well.
Exactly, yeah. And having it in 3 sections, there's space between each section for a reader to kind of take a breath and think, how does this relate to me, to my life, and how does it relate to the material that's come before and perhaps what's coming later? So, and I have I'll read just a very, very short section from the last section of the triptych essay. And Donna, I have a slideshow, if you don't mind. Are you able to put that up? Just have to find it. Oh, thank you. Books draw us inward, even when we're most in public. The great photographer André Cortez made a lifelong project of exploring that paradox. Between 1950 and the 1970s, he traveled the world, snapping candid photos of people with their books, their magazines, and the occasional newspaper. On rooftops, behind stage doors, on trains, in parks, in bars and shops, bent over trash bins, tucked into alcoves. Wherever he found readers, he recorded them in the act. Reading is the great leveler, the great lifter his images seem to suggest. In the Republic of Books, we are all equal. There is something almost unbearably poignant about these photographs today. Yet what we sense when we look at them is more than wistfulness for an imagined past, more than mere nostalgia. Shot from unexpected angles, they conceal complexities. Often we have to work to discern a subject within the frame. The experience mimics the act portrayed. In these images, we don't simply witness someone reading. Instead, we read someone reading. So what we feel when we look at them is something akin to deep readings, deep engagement. Okay. So thank you so much for those rich questions, Leona. And I would like to turn now back to Sylvie, if we could, for a moment, where we, not to where we left her exactly the last time, but not about to embark on a treacherous hike with a new man.
Right.
But I want to draw attention to a feature of your book that is, in fact, similar to mine, in that there is a kind of hinge in this book as well, or a story that might be seen as a hinge. So first of all, I should probably explain to people that most of the stories in If Sylvie Had 9 Lives are told from a very close third person perspective. So we are very much within mostly Sylvie's mind throughout most of these stories. But we don't hear from her in her voice. We also hear, there are also several stories told from the perspectives of other characters who are important in her life. So in one case, her aunt, a husband, a sister. Like we also get to know these characters' point of view on Sylvie, and that gives us it actually adds to the sort of multiplicity of ways that we know Sylvie, right? And you were talking about the ghost lives. It's almost, these stories, they don't reveal the ghost lives, but they do reveal a kind of that ghostly thing about how others see us. And it really contributes a lot of richness to the overall narrative, I thought, and a great deal of depth of feeling as well. In particular, that story told from Aunt Mary's point of view about Sylvie's mother. That was just an incredibly moving story. And I think I would love to know, if we have time, I would love to know more about that as well, and why you chose to tell that particular story from that point of view, and what effect you think that have. But for now, I want to ask about this. The sole story that we get in Sylvie's voice is smack dab in the middle of the book. And so in that sense, it functions as a kind of hinge, and it's a wonderful story told in the first person. So can you tell me a little bit about that decision and what led you there? And
I'll try.
Yeah.
Thanks for that question. And it's interesting what you were saying about the hinge in your own book, and it being about reading and the pictures of people reading, because this book, this story that acts as a hinge in my book, which is now entitled Honestly, comma, it used to be called, the original title was Independent Reading. And that was a way of referring to the fact that Sylvie was reading herself, or making an attempt at reading herself. So there's a nice correspondence between your hinge and my hinge that I just thought of just now when you were talking. Most of the stories in the book are in third person, a very close-in third person usually, which gives a certain freedom of portrayal that you don't always have when you're telling a story in first person. But partly because Sylvie as a character is so flawed. She has a number of grounds on which she can be criticized. And I knew from early on that it's only fair that I give her the chance to defend herself in one place, at least, to speak in her own voice. And in fact, I think she says something like, tell my side of the story in order to see on the way to understanding it better, something like that. So I was musing about different points of view and what can and can't be done. And at one point when I was building the book, I was talking to a wonderful editor about problems to do with point of view. And I think I was worried about some set of rules out there that I might be breaking, which was ridiculous because I'd already broken a lot of rules in deciding to send my character along 9 different storylines. So why would I be worried about the rules? Why not write a story in first person and allow Sylvie the chance to speak for herself? And the editor that I was talking with about this, when I expressed my hesitations about switching points of view in different places, she said, fiction is a capacious house. Mm. So I have a slide I would like to bring in here that shows you what that capacious house can look like before the blueprints are finalized. And I love that sentence, fiction is a capacious house. This wonderful editor is named Laura Hinchberger, and that sentence just stayed with me. I really recommend working with her. Now, you probably can't read much of this messy slide on your screen, but that's all right, because the point is to show what a messy process it can be to build a book. I scribbled and scribbled over this at various times when I was making decisions about where I wanted the tone to change in the book, where I wanted more drama or less drama, where I wanted the more dark parts of the storytelling or the more energetic parts of the storytelling. For instance, 5 years before The Hinge, the story right before The Hinge is, I guess it's 1989, and I've written Time to Do Something Right. And I wasn't sure what I would, when I wrote that, I wasn't sure what she would do that was right, but I knew that by that point in the book, just over a third of the way through, Sylvie had made a number of bad decisions and done some stupid things. And I wanted a more positive version of her to surface just for a while. But then 5 years later, in 1994, at what we're thinking of right now as the hinge of the book, we visit her in midlife, where she's in the most troubled life, I think, that the book shows at all. And I think of this story as Sylvie having an argument with herself, where she's finally just starting to take a look at herself and maybe confront or at least recognize her own pattern of insatiability. So I would like to just read a little bit in her own voice as first person. Mm-hmm. And just to set it up, in this story in 1994, she has been married to a man named Jack for 20 years, and they're celebrating their 20th anniversary. And because it's 1994, they're watching a movie. The kind of movie they're watching is a VHS tape because of the era. And they've just finished watching a movie, and we'll join them there. The machine was still on rewind when we left for the bedroom, where we stripped each other in a hurry. A special occasion will do that for us, even now, and even on a work night. Once naked, though, I had trouble surrendering to the moment. The movie with its other world, I forgot to say, the movie was Drugstore Cowboys. So if you're familiar with that movie, it will carry some resonance here for you. The movie with its other world had given me a thought that seemed bound right in with the passage of our 20 years. And just as my attentive husband was heading southward under the sheets, I said, you know, huh? You know, I said, sometimes I think about how there are so many different doors a person has the choice to walk through. And if you happen to, shush, honey. But Jack, don't you ever think about a set of doors like that? Don't you ever look at all those choices and think, this one looks interesting, but this one grabs me in a different way. And wow, what about that yellow door? Gee, Sylvie. He lifted the sheet so he could see past the spare geography of my body to my face. Sylvie, why don't you just get a bag of frozen peas and wrap it around my parts? Sorry. Later, coming back from the bathroom, I saw how he'd pulled the sheet to his neck and was holding it taut with his stubbled chin, as if he was afraid a draft would find its way in. One of his eyes was lit yellow by a slice of light that angled in from the hallway. He said, I always knew which door I'd go through. This wasn't news to me, but still I felt disappointment roll and resettle low in my gut like a handful of marbles. 20 years of marriage, he said, and my wife thinks she'd be better off with a dark-eyed dope fiend. Aren't we dramatic? I wanted him to know it was nothing to do with him. I love him. I almost always have, though sometimes more, sometimes less. Truly, I didn't wish I'd turned the handle on some alternate door. Couldn't he see that the mulling was about how a person only gets the one single door and she has to fit everything into the room she finds behind it? And the fact you can't try them all, those other lives you'll never, ever know, didn't that make him sad? A little? Jack is not the sort of person a woman would say that to. So I said, don't worry, babe. So that's from the single chapter in this novel where I've used first person point of view.
Oh, thank you so much. That's just it's so rich and wonderful and gives such a beautiful encapsulation of both Sylvie's character and the book itself and the many paths that it takes us on. And it also, I also hear the echoes, and anyone who's read the book now will also know that it refers back to the first story. It refers forward to other stories. And so it's so beautifully, intricately woven and just a very, very rich reading experience. So also,
thank you.
And also I love that, it's very funny. It really is.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to lace humor throughout the book. I have a sense of humor and I don't see a reason not to include it in my writing, although humor can be a tricky thing to pull off. You can't overdo it. At least I can't. It has to sort of sit quietly on the page in a very natural way. It can't be forced.
Well, it has to come from the situation and the characters too, right? In fiction, it has to feel natural to those characters and in that living that life, that particular, or walking through that particular door.
Yeah. Yeah, it does refer to other parts of the book, and the book in a way had to be sort of intertextual in terms of itself, because some of those lives do overlap for certain periods, and I had to keep a document of vital statistics to keep straight the births and deaths and ages of children.
Yes, absolutely. It must have been, as I read, I thought it must have been quite complex, and you must have had to have it there because, and as you were constructing each story, you would have to think, okay, in this life, what has she, who is she, who's seen who knows who, what's happened here, what's happened there. It was a lot to keep track of.
It led to some errors, of course, that I was very late in the writing process. I was still fixing errors about the age of certain children. And in cases where the story turned on that age, I had a little bit of trouble on my hands. So.
Yes, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I think it was also significant that you give Sylvie her own voice both in the middle of the book, but also in the middle of the period that we are looking at. So it's 20 years into the story, right, in her midlife when we get this view of her from her own perspective.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
So it does amount to a turning in a few different ways.
Yeah.
So that's the single story I wrote in the first person. In terms of big reader, almost all of the essays are in the first person, which is often the way of essays. But there are two notable exceptions. The one we talked about, the prose poems, where that's that invitational, inclusive second person you. And the other one is the closing essay. And when I see these two exceptions, I think then that also that nonfiction is also a capacious house in the way Laura spoke of it. So these are notable in their departure and point of view. The final essay, which you've used as the epilogue. I'm just
it's called White Matter. Yeah,
it's called White Matter. Here it is. Yes, and it's written in the third person about the girl or she. And I think of she fairly or unfairly as younger Susan. And I'll let you talk about that. But briefly, the essay it tells us about a girl whose mother has, in the way of some mothers said to her impatiently, put that book down and get outside. Now, I remember saying that as a mother myself, for better or for worse. And I'm thankful that I had a son who was a reader and would stay inside reading on certain days. Anyway, her mother has said, get outside. And she does, but she sneaks along with her the book, which is Oliver Twist, which she in some ways isn't really old enough to understand in its entirety, but nevertheless, it captivates her and it transports her until eventually she is returned to the present in a fairly unpleasant way. So that's one braid, or one strand of the braid, but you also braid in theories of personality, scientific research about what happens in the brain when a person reads. Can you talk about that point of view choice to use a third person? And also, this essay is neither part of the verso nor the recto, nor is it the hinge, but it's an epilogue. So what makes it suited to be an epilogue?
Thank you. Well, I mean, much as you had some struggles to come up with a way of finding a story that would do the job of tying up all the disparate strands, and yet leave things open in some way for the reader. I too had difficulty initially thinking about how I would do that. I wanted in this piece to, I think, to encapsulate a lot of the research about reading that I had of course done a huge amount of research about reading in the brain, and I wanted to encapsulate some of that and show that for the reader and in a narrative way, not in a dry sort of textbook kind of way. I wanted it to be part of a story because I think that helps us remember and hold on to that kind of information more. So I wanted to do that in the last piece. And I also wanted to, I think, engage the reader in a reflection about the very fact that most of the other pieces were written in the first person, the relationship between memory and fiction and nonfiction, right? So, and I thought, as I was doing this research about reading, I realized, well, actually, memory is fiction, And so if I have written all these memories, written out of all these memories, but memory is a kind of self-constructed fiction. And so the last piece of the book has to embody that principle by being written in the third person from outside. And it's also more reflective because, as you say, I think you were fair, absolutely fair in saying it's a younger Susan. So it's reflective. I'm looking back at that young reader and, telling a story about that young reader, and who is, in some sense, maybe a lot of readers at that stage. So
that Susan is younger Susan, but she isn't Susan now. But
no, she isn't Susan now, or she's Susan now, but in a very different way. So I was just going to read a little bit from that essay to give the tone or the effect. And I'll just start from the beginning. Leaving the cottage, the girl pushes the screen door as far as it will go, just to be sure that it will spring back with a satisfying smack. She does not look behind her, does not turn to see her mother's frown or the embittered twist of her gingham tea towel. She does not look because it serves her mother right. Get out, quit lying around for God's sake. Put away that book and go. The ground, knotted with pine roots and slippery with their needles, slopes toward a narrow estuary. Down there on the floating dock, the girl's little brother pokes in the brackish water with a net, looking for eels. If he catches any, her father will cook them on the hibachi for supper. She shudders. It's not that she's squeamish. Spiders, ants, wasps, mice, land snakes, tadpoles, toads, even the pickled brains in the lab where her father works, these she can look on with composure and even curiosity. But the thought of touching a live eel or any creature composed of slime sickens her. She turns from the water and heads for the fields, tucking up the hem of her skirt. A maxi sewn for a project in home economics class. It's a swath of white cotton with an elastic waistband and a wide eyelet ruffle at its bottom. Years from now, she'll reject this style for its tendency to make grown women look like little girls. But now she's convinced that her ground-sweeping skirt transforms her into someone taller and older than her 12 years, and that is why she wears it as often as she can, even though she hates the way it trips her up when she walks. Past the stand of pines, she crosses a gravel road and leaps a ditch. At last she comes to the grasses, waist-high, sweet-smelling, home on this sunny afternoon to grasshoppers and blackbirds and hundreds of yellow butterflies. Here, the sunlight scrubs the air to a transparent sheen. Here, a stray breeze carries the musk of wild rose and the tang of salt. She breathes, brushes dried lichen from a large, low stone, spreads her skirts round her, and pulls the offending book from the pocket of her kangaroo sweater. It serves her mother right. As she reads the afternoon away, the girl does not understand the difficulty of the task she is engaged in. She does not know her brain never evolved to read, does not know that to do so, it must recycle its related powers of visual and gestural recognition and connect these to its faculties for coding speech sounds and making meaning. She does not know that the cognitive, linguistic, and perceptual hoops she must jump in order to synchronize all these skills are so improbable and astonishing that one day they will be likened to a neurological three-ring circus. She only knows that she isn't, as her mother seems to believe, a slothful and lazy person. She only knows that, as usual, her mother is wrong.
Lovely. I remember wearing maxi skirts. I remember disappearing into a text that way and reading books that were beyond me at the time. I like too, especially the parts about what happens in the brain when a person reads, partly because I'm just curious about that, but partly because I think it helps us as writers to understand how to make writing powerful. Mm-hmm. What parts of the brain are activated when you write about taking an action, and the brain actually mimics that action in some way.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It reminds us. I mean, we always talk about the importance of action and sensory detail in writing, and understanding how reading works in the brain helps explain why that's so important for us.
Yeah. It's a good reminder.
Sure. Yeah. Just heading back to the idea of using the third person in this essay, I want to acknowledge how you and your essay, The Occupations of Muriel Thompson, probably subliminally influenced me to try this. I'm quite sure it must have, because I had not seen it done the way you did it before. And, then when I was writing this, I mean, it just came to me seemingly intuitively, but obviously we're deeply influenced by the writers we admire. And so I'm quite sure that was somewhere in the back of my reading brain and coming forward in my decision to try third person for this piece, White Matter.
Well, thank you for saying that. And it's gratifying to know that your work has played off in mine in whatever subliminal way. And the same has been true of your influence on me. And I think that this is a common thing, that we take inspiration from other writers all the time, whether we're conscious of it or not. And I happened to be writing an essay it was deep winter last year, and I was in the middle of an essay that I was trying to put way too many unrelated things into the essay. And I was losing faith that I could bring it all together. And so I did what I usually do, is I stopped thinking so hard and I stopped staring at it. And quite by chance, I happened on one of your essays online, and it was about, I think, a house, and you were moving from one house to another, a house you'd lived in a long time, and it had some memories. And I know that there was a lot of discipline that went into the structure of that piece, but for me as a reader, it felt very loose and open and freeing, and it gave me a sense of possibility. And then when I went back to my own essay, I suddenly found the shape of it, and that it isn't that I used the shape or anything more from your essay, but that your essay loosened me somehow into finding the shape of my own, which turned out to be a set of 6 heartbeats, pum, 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 pum. Oh. And so I think that's a good illustration of how, when you're stuck with your own writing, and this is something writers can always do, is turn to someone else's work and see where it takes you. It's a big part of the process.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thank you for telling me that. And I'm so touched, and I can't wait to read your essay now. And I'm very excited. I'm sure you have a book of nonfiction coming out soon, and I very much look forward to it.
Yes, well, it's in the works. Thank you.
In the works, right.
Yeah.
And I mean, but you're absolutely right. This kind of influence is so important. And it's just really amazing to me that 2 writers who have never met, we lived in different parts of the country and had not met in person, and then eventually only met briefly once, have had such an important sense of, well, there's some synchrony between our work that we both recognized. And I'm sure that it's largely due to our shared interest in structure. Yeah. So, such a pleasure talking with you, Leona.
Pleasure talking with you too. Thank you so much, Susan. I hope we can do this again.
And thank you so much to Donna and to Wild Words North for having us today. It's really great to have been here.
Yes, I echo that. Thank you.